Adventure Time is a world layered with mysteries, and some of its darkest tales reach back to times long before the main story begins. Among the most haunting elements of Oo's history is the presence of vampires, creatures who stand apart from most of the monsters and beings scattered across the land. Unlike the many mutants or magical hybrids born from the fallout of the Mushroom War, vampires feel older, stranger, and more deliberate. Their existence is not an accident of science or mutation, but the result of a magical condition that spreads like a curse. This makes them unique among the many threats in Ooo, because while most creatures are products of a chaotic new world, vampires carry an aura of ancient menace, a reminder that not all dangers began with the cataclysm that reshaped Earth. By the time of Marceline's childhood, vampires were already an established force. They were not a new terror suddenly emerging from the wasteland, but a long-standing presence that preyed on the scattered remnants of humanity and other survivors. When the Mushroom War destroyed civilization, leaving broken landscapes and desperate communities, vampires thrived. They were apex predators, perfectly suited to hunt in a world where defenses were weak and order was gone. To live in those times meant living under the shadow of their hunger, because vampires did not simply take blood to survive. They also asserted power, enforcing dominance through fear. This made them more than just monsters lurking in the dark. They became a constant reminder that survival in Ooo was precarious, and that cruelty often triumphed where law and structure had collapsed. The way vampirism functions in the series reveals much about its origins. A vampire's bite is not only an act of feeding, but also an act of transformation, capable of turning victims into vampires themselves unless the infection is stopped. This parasitic method of spreading ensured that the threat of vampirism was self-perpetuating. Even when individual vampires were destroyed, the potential for more always existed. A single outbreak could lead to entire communities being turned, creating waves of new predators who carried the cycle forward. In this sense, vampirism behaves less like a creature and more like a magical disease, one that refuses to die out because every victim is also a potential carrier. This explains why vampires endured for centuries, despite repeated attempts to destroy them. What further distinguishes these beings is the nature of their abilities. Ordinary creatures might rely on strength or numbers, but vampires in Ooo manifest supernatural powers. Some could hypnotize their prey, others heal endlessly, while others shift their shapes or wield overwhelming physical might. These are not random mutations, but structured archetypes, almost as if the curse of vampirism encoded specific roles into its victims. This structure suggests that vampirism is bound to a deeper, more ancient magic, one that grants abilities tied to mythological archetypes we recognize from folklore. The rules are clear. They can be destroyed by sunlight, by staking, and they hold abilities that mirror the legends of vampires across human cultures. By grounding them in archetypes so familiar to us, Adventure Time positions them as creatures of myth, given new life in the apocalyptic setting of Ooo. For Marceline, growing up in a world stalked by these predators, vampires were not just figures of fear, but part of the fabric of daily existence. The desolation left by the Mushroom War meant that, as a child, she was vulnerable, wandering through ruins, and these creatures became the most direct threat she faced. They were part of the environment that shaped her resilience and her eventual path as a vampire hunter. To young survivors, vampires represented the merciless law of nature, a reminder that no amount of innocence or youth could shield one from predators. The trauma of living in their shadow would leave marks not only on Marceline, but on the entire era of survivors who learned that the night was never safe. The symbolic weight of vampires goes beyond their role as predators. they embody cycles of history that refuse to end. Even when heroes defeat them, they return. Their infection spreads again, their powers resurface, and their shadow falls once more across Ooo. This cycle mirrors Adventure Time's broader theme that the past never truly disappears. Just as the scars of the Mushroom War linger in every ruined city and mutated creature, the legacy of vampirism lingers in the bloodlines and memories of Oo's people. The show portrays vampires as a recurring inevitability, something that cannot be erased but only resisted over and over again. This persistence also highlights why vampires were such a defining force. Other monsters may terrorize for a time and vanish, but vampires endure through structure, immortality, and infection. They embody hunger that cannot be satisfied, and through their survival, they shape the stories of those who oppose them. For Adventure Time, this made them more than just an enemy faction. They became symbols of trauma, addiction, and the relentless cycles of violence that characters like Marceline had to confront not once, but across her entire life. The origins of vampirism in Ooo are deliberately left mysterious, and this ambiguity is part of their power. They are not tied to a single kingdom, elemental, or godlike force that can be confronted or destroyed. Instead, they exist as a curse that spreads from creature to creature, old enough that no one remembers its first source. In this way, they become timeless within the mythos of the show. Whether in the wastelands of Marceline's youth or the modern conflicts of the miniseries stakes, they return with the same hunger and the same inevitability. Their beginnings are less important than the fact that they never truly end. Understanding their origins allows us to understand why they loom so large in Oo's history. They did not emerge from chance or mutation, but from deliberate, enduring magic. They thrived in the collapse of civilization, feeding on the weak and multiplying through contagion. They embodied fear, hunger, and recurrence, making them more than creatures of the night. They became symbols of history's persistence, the traumas and threats that outlive the people who first suffer them. To know the Vampires of Ooo is to understand that some forces in Adventure Time cannot be eliminated, only resisted, and that their cycle of return is as much a part of Ooo as its kingdoms, its heroes, and its ruins. To understand the true scope of vampirism in Ooo, one must move beyond the image of isolated predators and recognize the organization and hierarchy that once gave them dominion. Vampires were not simply scattered wanderers feeding in the shadows. At their height, they existed under the structure of the vampire court, a collection of beings whose powers and personalities defined the terror of their age. This court was not a casual alliance, but an institution that imposed order upon chaos, raising vampires from mere monsters into rulers who could dominate the wastelands after the fall of humanity's civilization. The rise of the vampire court represents one of the most pivotal moments in the history of Ooo, because it marks the transition from scattered feeding to an era of collective rule, where the nightmare of vampirism became not just a personal fear, but an organized dominion over entire regions. The court was defined by 5 figures, each embodying a particular archetype of vampirism: the Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon, and the Vampire King himself. Together, they were more than a council. They were the embodiment of the vampire condition, with each figure representing a facet of hunger, power, and immortality. In their rise, one can see not only the sheer menace of vampirism, but also the allure that comes with power unchecked by mortality. These vampires were not content to feed and vanish into the night. They were conquerors, setting themselves apart as symbols of inevitable domination. The Fool, though often dismissed by others, played a crucial role in the early spread of the court's reputation. His powers of agility, mischief, and unpredictability made him a terrifying opponent for those who underestimated him. His name suggested weakness, yet his nature as a trickster meant he could slip through defences, toy with his prey, and sow confusion wherever he appeared. The Fool represented the chaos of vampirism, its ability to infiltrate and undermine. Though others in the court saw themselves as rulers or warriors, the Fool was the embodiment of the unpredictability that made vampires impossible to control. The Empress brought another dimension to the court's power. Unlike the Fool's chaotic approach, she thrived on control, using her hypnotic abilities to dominate the will of others. With a glance or a word, she could bend survivors into servants, stripping them not only of their freedom, but of their very sense of self. In her, the seductive side of vampirism was made literal. The Empress embodied the theme that submission can be as dangerous as violence, and her reign over humans and lesser creatures showed that vampirism was not only about consuming blood, but also about consuming agency. Her presence in the court ensured that the vampires were feared not just for what they could take from bodies, but for how they could enslave minds. The Hierophant was perhaps the most traditionalist of the court, enforcing the strict laws of vampirism and acting as a guardian of their customs. His obsession with order reflected the attempt to elevate vampirism into something more than survival. For the Hierophant, being a vampire was not only a curse, but a society with rules, and he wielded his powers of transformation and mastery of the old ways to enforce this. His role in the court was to preserve what he saw as the purity of their kind, ensuring that the vampires remained a structured force rather than a loose band of monsters. If the Fool represented chaos and the Empress represented control, the Hierophant represented tradition, tying the court to an identity that extended beyond the whims of individuals. The Moon was unlike the others, embodying the inevitability of vampirism itself. Her regenerative abilities made her practically unkillable, and in this resilience, she symbolized the persistence of the vampire line. No matter how many times she was struck down, she rose again, healing her wounds and continuing the cycle. The Moon was less a ruler and more a reminder that vampires could not truly be ended. She stood as proof that the condition of vampirism was eternal, that attempts to destroy it would always falter against its ability to regenerate. Within the court, her presence gave the others confidence. For as long as she existed, there was always the assurance that their kind could endure. Above them all stood the Vampire King, a figure of immense power and charisma whose philosophy elevated the court beyond mere predators. Unlike his subordinates, the king carried an air of reflection, a recognition of what it meant to rule rather than merely consume. His strength was undeniable. He could crush opponents with ease. His fangs carried the infection with unmatched potency, and his presence demanded submission. But it was his vision that defined him. The king believed in vampirism not only as a way of feeding, but as a way of life, a destiny that placed vampires above all others. Under his reign, the court was not only a gang of monsters, but a monarchy, with himself at the centre as both predator and philosopher king. The rise of this court changed the landscape of Ooo. Where once survivors might have feared random attacks, they now lived under the threat of systematic domination. The court's existence turned vampirism into an institution, and their combined powers ensured that resistance was often futile. Communities were enslaved or wiped out, and the wastelands became territories under the shadow of the court. This was the world that young Marceline inherited, a world where the Vampire King and his lieutenants reigned not only by strength, but by inevitability. For many, survival meant evasion, running from one ruin to another in hopes of avoiding the gaze of the court's hunters. What makes the rise of the court so significant in Adventure Time's mythology is the way it framed vampires as more than random creatures. They became an empire of the night, their members embodying every aspect of the condition, chaos, seduction, law, resilience, and dominion. This collective identity elevated them from folklore monsters into archetypal forces, each representing a different aspect of what it meant to live forever by consuming others. Their rise explained why vampires were so feared, why the world required a champion to stand against them, and why Marceline's eventual campaign against them would become legendary. Yet even in their reign, there was a flaw inherent in their structure. The court's diversity of personalities and philosophies made them powerful as a whole, but also fragile in their unity. The Fool's mischief, the Empress's domination, the Hierophant's tradition, the Moon's persistence, and the King's authority did not always align. They were a council bound together by necessity rather than loyalty, and this tension would eventually make them vulnerable. But in their prime, when their powers were combined, they seemed unstoppable. They were not only predators, but rulers, and for a time, the night belonged to them. The rise of the vampire court is one of the most important chapters in Oo's history, because it established a clear era of vampiric dominance, one that shaped the lives of those who lived in its shadow, and one that set the stage for Marceline's own transformation into a vampire hunter. Without understanding the court, one cannot understand the scale of what she achieved or the magnitude of what she destroyed. The court was the embodiment of everything vampirism could be, from trickery to tyranny, and its existence explains why their eventual fall was so momentous. Once the vampire court had established itself as the ruling force among the predators of Ooo, the world entered a period remembered not for progress or growth, but for dread. Survivors who wandered the wastelands told stories of nightfall as if it were a sentence, of territories where no fire burned after dusk and where whole communities vanished without explanation. This was the age of fear, an era where vampires reigned not only through direct attack, but through the sheer weight of their reputation. To live under their shadow was to exist in constant anticipation of loss, knowing that no stronghold was permanent, no victory final, and no safety guaranteed. What set this age apart was not only the strength of the vampires themselves, but the despair they inspired. It was not uncommon for groups of survivors to scatter at the mere rumour that the court had passed through a region. The Fool might dart unseen among travellers, spreading panic with his sudden appearances and disappearances. The Empress could arrive without violence, stripping communities of willpower until they became her obedient thralls. The Hierophant might stalk the wilds, punishing even lesser vampires who dared disobey his strictures, while the Moon lingered as a presence that could not be destroyed, haunting those who thought they had won only to discover their efforts undone by her endless healing. And above all of them, the King's presence was enough to shatter the morale of entire groups before a battle had even begun. His domination was not purely physical, but psychological. The idea of him was sometimes more terrifying than his actual attacks. This atmosphere of dread created a cycle in which vampires rarely needed to fight at all. Fear alone scattered settlements, broke alliances, and drove survivors into hiding. Whole bands of humans lived as nomads, unable to establish permanent homes because they believed the court would inevitably find them. The wastelands of post-war Earth already offered little in the way of comfort, but under the reign of the vampires, even the hope of community became fragile. Where kingdoms and structures might have once risen, they instead collapsed before they could take shape, leaving a void where fear itself became the ruling order. For Marceline, who grew up during this time, the Age of Fear was formative. Her earliest memories of wandering through ruins, scavenging for food, and surviving among predators were shaped by the ever-present threat of vampires. They were not merely enemies to her, but the defining feature of the world she lived in. The trauma of abandonment, of being left in the aftermath of the Mushroom War, was compounded by the reality that safety was not only absent, but actively hunted. To understand Marceline's later actions as a vampire hunter, one must see her youth as a constant confrontation with dread. Vampires were not occasional intruders, they were the architects of the very terror that defined her childhood. The spread of this fear was not only the result of the court's direct actions, but also of the system they enforced. Vampirism as an infection meant that wherever the court struck, new vampires could be born. A single bite, a single moment of weakness, could mean that a family member or a trusted companion would rise again as a predator. This instability made trust difficult. Survivors feared not only the court, but each other, for anyone who had fallen might return transformed. This paranoia deepened the isolation of communities, ensuring that resistance was rare. The court thrived in this atmosphere, ruling less through organized armies than through the inevitability of infection. At the heart of this age was the notion that vampires represented inevitability itself. They could not be killed by ordinary means. They could not be escaped, for their powers allowed them to infiltrate, to control, to regenerate, and to destroy. They were not a foe to be defeated once and forgotten, but a recurring certainty. And it was this sense of inevitability that defined the Age of Fear, the belief that no matter how far one fled, the vampires would rise again. The fool's tricks would confound defences, the Empress's gaze would break wills, the Hierophant's laws would ensure order among their kind, the moon would rise unending, and the king would dominate all who opposed him. Fear was not simply a response to them, fear was the world they created. This period also shaped the legends of Ooo. Survivors whispered stories of those who resisted the vampires and fell, of heroes who tried to rise against the court only to vanish into the night. These tales were passed down not as encouragement, but as warnings. The myth of invincibility that surrounded the court made opposition seem foolish, almost suicidal. And in many cases, these stories were not myths at all, but lived experiences, repeated again and again as the vampires spread across the land. For children growing up in this world, fear was inherited, baked into their understanding of reality. It is important to recognize that while the vampires thrived during this time, they were not merely mindless predators. The court structure allowed them to rule strategically. The Empress did not need to slaughter when she could enslave. The Hierophant did not need to spread chaos when he could enforce order. The fool could scatter groups without ever drawing blood. This versatility made the vampires even more difficult to resist. They were not predictable enemies, but adaptable overlords, shifting their strategies depending on the prey. Communities that fortified themselves against brute force found their members turned by the Empress. Those who believed they had killed their tormentors discovered the moon regenerating before their eyes. This constant adaptation kept survivors in a state of despair, for no defense ever seemed adequate. Marceline's rise as a hunter is often framed as a heroic response to the vampires. But in the context of the Age of Fear, it was also a necessity. For someone abandoned to this world, the choice was stark: succumb to the dread, or stand against it. Marceline's decision to fight transformed her from a survivor into a legend, but her struggle was never simply personal. It was born from the need to break the cycle of inevitability that the vampires had imposed on all of Ooo. To resist them was to resist the very concept of fear as a ruling force. The Age of Fear eventually gave way to change, as the court would fall to Marceline's relentless campaign, but its impact never truly disappeared. Even after their defeat, the memory of that time haunted survivors. The terror instilled by the court was so profound that their names and powers continued to echo long after they were gone. The vampires left scars not only on individuals, but on the very psyche of Ooo. For Marceline, these scars took the form of trauma that followed her into adulthood, shaping her relationships and her identity. For the world at large, the scars were the stories, the myths, and the lingering paranoia that even when the vampires were gone, they might one day rise again. The Age of Fear stands as one of the most important periods in the mythology of Adventure Time, because it demonstrates how power can rule not through numbers or armies, but through the cultivation of dread. The court thrived not only because they were strong, but because they convinced the world that resistance was futile. They turned fear itself into a weapon, wielding it as effectively as any claw or fang. In doing so, they left a legacy that defined an entire generation of survivors, including the child who would eventually rise to destroy them. When people speak of the Vampires of Ooo, no single name carries the same weight as the Vampire King. His reign marked the height of their power and the full realization of what vampirism could mean when embodied in a single figure of overwhelming strength, cunning, and vision. While the other members of the court represented facets of the vampire condition, trickery, domination, tradition, resilience, the king stood above them as the synthesis of those elements, a monarch who both embodied and commanded the entire vampire identity. His reign was not just about feeding or terrorizing, it was about shaping an empire of predators, one that cast its shadow across the wastelands and left scars that endured even after he was defeated. The Vampire King was not merely the strongest vampire. He was the one who gave structure to their existence. Without him, the court might have remained a loose alliance of powerful individuals, each pursuing their own appetites and ambitions. With him at the centre, however, the court became a monarchy with hierarchy, law, and a sense of destiny. The king believed in vampirism not as an accident of infection, but as a way of life, a state of being that set his kind above all others. His reign elevated vampires from predators to rulers, from monsters to lords of the night. This was not just domination by hunger, but domination by philosophy. The belief that the vampires were the rightful inheritors of the earth after the Mushroom War had swept away its old civilizations. Part of the king's power lay in his charisma. He did not need to constantly assert himself with brute force, though he had more than enough strength to crush any opponent. His authority was built on the perception that he was inevitable. He had a way of framing his existence as natural law, presenting himself as the embodiment of what it meant to survive in the new world. This was perhaps his greatest weapon, the ability to convince others, both vampire and prey, that his rule was not a choice, but a certainty. Survivors whispered his name with dread, not only because of what he could do, but because of what he represented. To many, he was not a tyrant to be overthrown, but a force of nature to be endured. In his reign, the king enforced order among vampires, preventing them from collapsing into chaos. The fool's trickery might have spiraled into anarchy without the king's restraint. The empress's domination of minds might have become reckless without his guidance. The Hierophant's obsession with law found meaning because it was tied to the king's larger vision, and even the moon's endless regeneration served the stability of the court under his reign. Each member of the court was powerful in their own right. but it was the king who ensured that their powers were directed toward maintaining dominance rather than tearing themselves apart. This unity under his leadership is what made the vampires truly terrifying, because they acted not as scattered predators, but as an empire. The king himself possessed powers that set him apart even from his lieutenants. His strength was unmatched, his speed overwhelming, and his ability to infect others carried more potency than that of ordinary vampires. When he struck, he did so with a force that few could resist. But what truly made him formidable was the balance of his powers with his intellect. Unlike the fool, he was not reckless. Unlike the empress, he was not consumed by vanity. Unlike the Hierophant, he was not bound by rigidity. Unlike the moon, he was not defined solely by endurance. He carried each of these traits in some form, but integrated them into a larger whole, making him unpredictable and difficult to counter. The philosophy of the king is crucial to understanding his reign. He did not see vampirism purely as hunger or curse, but as an identity, one that was superior to mortal life. In this way, he framed himself as more than a monster. He was a monarch presiding over a higher order of existence. This philosophy provided the vampires with a sense of purpose that extended beyond feeding. It gave them the justification to see themselves as the rightful rulers of the wastelands, as beings who had transcended the fragility of mortality. Under the king, vampirism was not only a means of survival, but a destiny, and this belief bound his followers to him with more strength than fear alone could achieve. For survivors living under his reign, this made resistance seem futile. They were not only facing a predator, but a king who believed he had inherited the earth. His words and actions reinforced the sense of inevitability that defined the age of fear. To stand against him was not simply to risk death, but to defy what he claimed was the natural order. This is why stories of resistance often ended not in triumph, but in tragedy, and why the king's reputation grew into something mythic. His reign blurred the line between monster and monarch, making him as much a symbol as a physical presence. Yet even in his strength and charisma, the king was not without complexity. Unlike some of his subordinates, he possessed a reflective nature that set him apart. In the Stakes miniseries, when resurrected, he reveals a side of himself that seeks freedom from vampirism, suggesting that beneath his reign was a recognition of the curse's weight. This retroactively casts his rule in a new light. Was his dominance driven purely by hunger and ambition? Or was it also an attempt to bring order to a condition he knew was inherently destructive? This ambiguity makes his reign more compelling. He was not only a tyrant, but a thinker, one who shaped vampirism into an empire because he saw no other way to control it. The king's reign left lasting consequences on Ooo. It established a precedent that vampires were not just pests to be swatted away, but forces to be reckoned with, beings who could shape entire eras. His rule created the myths and traumas that defined the survivors who lived under his shadow, including Marceline. The fact that she eventually rose to defeat him only amplifies his significance, because her legend as a hunter is built upon the foundation of his dominance. Without the Vampire King, there would be no campaign that defined her early life, no struggle that forced her into the role of champion against an impossible foe. His reign set the stage for her destiny, even as it scarred her childhood. To consider the Vampire King's reign is to recognize the peak of vampire power in Ooo. He was the figure who unified their kind, who transformed scattered predators into a monarchy, who turned hunger into ideology, and who left behind a legacy that would echo long after his defeat. His reign was not only an era of domination, but also an age of definition where vampirism took on its fullest form. Even in defeat, his shadow remained, resurfacing centuries later to challenge Marceline once again. This is the measure of his reign, that even when gone, he was never truly gone, his presence lingering as both memory and threat, as symbol and scar. Before Marceline, the Vampire Queen became one of the most iconic figures in Adventure Time, before she was known as a powerful vampire hunter or a centuries-old musician grappling with her identity. She was a child, wandering the ruins of a broken world. Her earliest encounters with vampires did not come at a time of strength or confidence, but in the fragile years of survival after the Mushroom War, when she was small, vulnerable, and learning what it meant to endure in a land where predators ruled. To understand the full arc of the Vampires of Ooo, one must also understand what they meant to Marceline in her formative years, because for her, they were not merely legendary figures or distant threats. They were the shape of fear itself, enemies she saw with her own eyes, and terrors that forced her to grow up far faster than any child should. Marceline's childhood was already marked by abandonment and instability. Her father, Hunson Abadir, returned to the Nightosphere, leaving her alone in a dangerous world, and her human mother eventually passed away, leaving her without consistent parental protection. In a land still scarred by nuclear devastation, where food was scarce and the safety of communities could not be counted on, survival became her daily task. And in that survival, vampires were the greatest predators she would come to know. When the vampire court spread across the wastelands, Marceline was among those who lived under their shadow, and her earliest memories of them were not abstract but visceral. The fear of nightfall, the hunger in their eyes, and the knowledge that even a moment of weakness could be fatal. These early encounters with vampires shaped her in two crucial ways. First, they instilled in her a deep mistrust of safety. For most children, the idea of safety is tied to the presence of caregivers or the walls of a home. But for Marceline, such structures were unreliable. A safe place could be overrun in an instant. A friend or companion could be turned by a bite and become a monster. Even in moments when she found companionship, the threat of betrayal or sudden loss hovered nearby, because vampirism spread not only fear but paranoia. The infection of vampirism meant that trust was always fragile, and Marceline grew up learning that her world could change without warning. The second way these encounters shaped her was in the forging of resilience. From a young age, she was forced to fight back, not as a trained warrior, but as a child refusing to succumb. She scavenged for weapons, developed instincts for survival, and discovered within herself a resourcefulness that would later blossom into her legendary campaigns against the vampires. These formative struggles were not victories in the grand sense. Often they were small escapes, moments where she avoided death by luck or quick thinking. But for Marceline, each of these encounters was a lesson. That fear could be resisted, that survival required cleverness, and that the vampires, while terrifying, were not invincible. One of the most poignant aspects of Marceline's early life is how these encounters blurred the line between terror and loneliness. Vampires were not just enemies, they were symbols of a world where she was forced to stand alone. In the absence of her father and the fragility of human communities, her interactions with vampires underscored her isolation. The way they preyed on the weak reminded her of her own vulnerability, but also of the absence of anyone who might protect her. In this way, her encounters with them were not only battles for survival, but confrontations with abandonment itself. The vampires became the physical embodiment of the dangers of being left behind. Her relationship to the Vampire King, even in these early years, is worth noting. Though she would not face him in direct battle until she grew older, the stories of his reign reached her, and his presence loomed over her childhood. The king's philosophy of inevitability, the idea that vampires were the inheritors of the world, made its way into the whispers of survivors, and Marceline grew up knowing that to resist him was to resist not only a powerful being, but the very narrative that defined her era. Even before she confronted him directly, he was a figure of dread in her imagination, a name that carried with it the weight of all her fears. Despite the terror, there were also moments in these early encounters that hinted at the complexities that would later define her identity. Marceline was not yet a vampire, but her path was already tied to them. Each confrontation forced her to acknowledge their power, to measure herself against them, and to wrestle with the question of what kind of person she would become in a world defined by predators. These formative years planted the seeds of both her determination to destroy them and the irony that she would eventually become one of them. This irony gives her story its tragic edge, that the child who once feared them most deeply would one day embody their condition. The trauma of these encounters cannot be overstated. Marceline carried those memories into adulthood, and they surfaced in her relationships, her music, and her constant struggle with identity. Her songs often circle themes of abandonment, survival, and the scars left by her past. When she sings about loneliness or the difficulty of trusting others, those themes are not abstract, but rooted in real experiences from her youth. The vampires she faced as a child were not only physical enemies, but emotional milestones, reminders of what she had lost and what she had endured. It is also important to note that these encounters shaped not only Marceline, but also the myth of her as a figure in Ooo. Survivors who witnessed her resilience began to see her as a kind of symbol themselves, even before her legendary campaigns against the court. The child who stood up to vampires became a story passed from one group to another, a tale of defiance that provided hope in an otherwise hopeless age. In this way, Marceline's encounters with vampires helped to transform her into more than just a survivor. She became a beacon of resistance, proof that the cycle of inevitability imposed by the vampires could be broken, even if only in small moments. When we look back at Marceline's earliest interactions with the Vampires of Ooo, we see not only the beginnings of her personal journey, but also the shaping of an entire era. Her encounters reveal the lived experience of the Age of Fear, grounding it not in myth or philosophy, but in the perspective of a child forced to confront monsters directly. They show how the reign of the vampires was not only a grand narrative of domination, but also an intimate story of survival, where every night was a battle and every escape was a victory. And they show how those encounters, traumatic as they were, laid the foundation for the hunter Marceline would one day become. The legacy of these early encounters lives on not only in the stories of Ooo, but in Marceline's very identity. She would carry the scars of those days into every choice she made, every battle she fought, and every song she sang. Her childhood was not defined by innocence, but by confrontation with terror, and it was in those encounters with vampires that she began to forge the strength, resilience, and complexity that would make her one of Adventure Time's most enduring characters. The child who wandered through ruins and survived against impossible odds eventually became something far greater. A hunter, feared by the very predators who once terrorized her. Marceline's transformation from a vulnerable girl into the vampire hunter is one of the most striking evolutions in Adventure Time's mythology, not because it was sudden, but because it was born out of necessity. Her early encounters with vampires, filled with fear, loneliness, and survival, hardened her into someone who refused to let predators define the world around her. In choosing to fight back, Marceline changed not only her own story, but the history of Ooo, standing as the singular figure who broke the cycle of inevitability that had defined the Age of Fear. The rise of Marceline as a hunter cannot be separated from the trauma of her youth. Living without parents, wandering a hostile world and facing constant threats, she had no one else to turn to. Resistance was not a choice made from luxury. It was survival made deliberate. Instead of running endlessly from the vampires who stalked the wastelands, she decided to turn and face them. That decision marked the birth of her legend. Every battle she fought, every vampire she destroyed, chipped away at the aura of invincibility that surrounded them. To the survivors of Ooo, the very idea that someone could stand against the court and live was revolutionary. To the vampires themselves, her existence was an anomaly, a mortal who would not bend, would not break, and would not be consumed. Marceline's weapon of choice, the night sword, became as much a part of her legend as her name. With it, she was able to pierce through vampire resilience, striking at the heart of creatures who believed themselves immortal. The night sword gave her not only the means to kill, but also the symbol of her defiance. Survivors told stories of a young girl wielding a blade larger than herself, stalking the predators who had once stalked her. In those stories, she was no longer the frightened child of her past, but a force of vengeance, a shadow in the wastelands, whose name carried as much fear for vampires as theirs had once carried for humans. Her campaign was not easy, nor was it without cost. Each battle took its toll, forcing Marceline to learn and adapt. She faced the Fool's chaos, the Empress's domination, the Hierophant's rigid strength, the Moon's endless healing, and finally the King's overwhelming power. But she never faced them all at once. Her legend grew step by step, each victory a miracle, each defeat narrowly avoided until she learned how to turn the tide. What made Marceline unique was not just her strength, but her persistence. Vampires were creatures of inevitability. They returned again and again. But Marceline matched inevitability with determination, meeting their endless hunger with her endless resolve. In facing them, she also began to discover the depths of her own abilities. Though not yet a vampire herself, Marceline carried within her traces of her father's demonic nature, powers that allowed her to survive encounters that would have killed ordinary humans. She could levitate, transform, and endure beyond her years, gifts that combined with her willpower to make her a hunter unlike any the vampires had ever faced. These powers gave her an edge, but they also deepened her identity crisis. Was she simply human with a cursed heritage, or something else entirely? Each battle against the vampires forced her to confront that question, and each victory pushed her further into the space between predator and prey. The significance of Marceline's campaign cannot be overstated. By systematically hunting the vampires, she dismantled the structure of the court that had defined the Age of Fear. Survivors who once hid in ruins began to see hope. The myths of vampire invincibility shattered piece by piece, replaced by stories of a girl who hunted them down and lived to tell the tale. For the first time in centuries, fear no longer dictated every action. Marceline gave people permission to imagine a world without vampires, and that shift in perception was as powerful as any blade. She didn't just kill predators, she killed despair. Yet, even as she rose as a hunter, Marceline carried the emotional cost of her role. To dedicate one's life to hunting was to dedicate one's life to loneliness. She was often on the move, unable to build stable relationships, because every night was another battle waiting to happen. In choosing to become a hunter, she sacrificed the chance to live as anything else. For a child who had already lost her parents, who had grown up in isolation, this sacrifice deepened her wounds even as it elevated her legend. She was celebrated as a savior, but she lived as an exile, her life defined by combat and survival rather than peace and companionship. Her relationship to the vampires themselves also grew more complicated. In hunting them, Marceline came to know them not only as enemies, but as individuals. The fool's unpredictability, the empress's cruel confidence, the hierophant's obsessive traditions, the moon's strange resilience, and the king's charisma. These were not faceless monsters, but beings with personalities, philosophies, and contradictions. To destroy them, Marceline had to understand them, and in understanding them, she carried pieces of them with her. Her identity, as a hunter, was not built only on her victories, but on the reflection of her enemies in her own story. This reflection would later come full circle when she became a vampire herself, but even in her hunter days, the seeds of that irony were already planted. The title Vampire Hunter was not one she claimed for herself, but one given to her by those who witnessed her battles. In the wastelands, stories of her exploits spread, told by frightened survivors around campfires, repeated by travelers who had seen her fight, and whispered by those who had lost loved ones to vampires, but found hope in her defiance. These stories often exaggerated her powers, painting her as larger than life, but at their core, they captured the truth. Marceline had shifted the balance of Oo's history. In an age ruled by predators, she had become the predator of predators, a child who had grown into a figure of myth. Her legacy as a hunter endures in Adventure Time because it defines the contrast of her later life. The Marceline who plays music, who struggles with relationships, who grapples with her identity as both vampire and demon, is the same person who once stalked the wastelands with a sword in her hand. The trauma, the resilience, and the contradictions of her youth all flowed from those years of hunting. Without that chapter of her life, she would not be the complex character who later bonds with Princess Bubblegum, who sings of her loneliness, or who confronts her father and her past. The vampire hunter years are not only a tale of battles won, but a tale of a child forced to shape herself against the harshest enemies imaginable. In the end, what makes Marceline's time as a vampire hunter so powerful is that it represents both triumph and tragedy. She succeeded in defeating the court, breaking the cycle of inevitability, and freeing Ooh from an age of dread. But in doing so, she also cemented her own path as someone forever tied to the vampires she hated. Her victories came at the cost of innocence, stability, and companionship. She became legendary, but she also became marked, carrying the scars of her battles into every stage of her long life. To understand Marceline the Vampire Queen, one must first understand Marceline the Vampire Hunter, because it was in those years of defiance and resilience that her identity was forged, her legend born, and her destiny sealed. The legend of Marceline as the vampire hunter reaches its height in the story of how she destroyed the vampire court. For centuries, the court had reigned as the embodiment of inevitability, an organized body of predators whose powers and philosophies made them seem unassailable. They were the apex of fear in a ruined world, the shadow under which humanity and other survivors cowered. And yet, it was Marceline, the abandoned child turned relentless hunter, who brought their reign to an end. The fall of the court was not a single battle, but a campaign that unfolded step by step, with each confrontation marking a transformation in Marceline herself and a shift in the balance of power in Ooh. To dismantle the court, Marceline had to face its members one by one. Each vampire represented not only a unique challenge, but also an aspect of vampirism that she would need to overcome. The Fool was among the first she defeated, and though his reputation often painted him as weaker than the others, his unpredictability made him dangerous. His tricks and agility allowed him to confound opponents, and his chaotic energy meant that no encounter with him could be anticipated. For Marceline, facing the Fool was a test of adaptability. She learned quickly that brute strength or simple strategy would not be enough. She had to think as fast as he moved, anticipate his chaos, and turn his unpredictability against him. By defeating him, she demonstrated that she could outmatch not just strength, but cunning, breaking down the myth that vampires were untouchable in their versatility. The Empress was a different kind of battle entirely. Her power lay not in force, but in control, bending others to her will through hypnotic domination. Marceline's encounter with her was less about physical combat and more about resisting the pull of submission. The Empress represented the temptation of surrender, the idea that one could give up freedom and still live, if only by becoming a servant. For survivors of Ooo, she was the most insidious of the vampires, because she turned communities not by destroying them, but by making them complicit in their own subjugation. For Marceline, resisting the Empress was a test of willpower, of refusing to let her identity be overwritten. Their clash was not only about survival, but about autonomy. And in defeating the Empress, Marceline affirmed her independence in a world that had tried to strip it away. The Hierophant proved to be a more traditional battle. Obsessed with the laws of vampirism and the purity of their kind, he represented rigidity and tradition. His mastery of shape-shifting and combat made him one of the most physically imposing members of the court. To fight him was to confront vampirism at its most disciplined and martial, the opposite of the Fool's chaos. Marceline's struggle with him was a duel of endurance, testing her ability to counter not only brute force, but the weight of centuries of discipline behind his techniques. By defeating him, she shattered the idea that the vampire's traditions made them untouchable, proving that even the most rigid structures could fall. The Moon presented perhaps the most daunting challenge. With her endless healing powers, she embodied the cycle of vampirism itself. No matter how many times she was struck down, she would rise again, whole and relentless. Fighting her was an exercise in futility, a battle that seemed designed to crush the spirit of anyone who attempted it. For Marceline, defeating the Moon was not only a physical victory, but a symbolic one, because it proved that even the cycle of regeneration could be broken. To destroy the Moon was to destroy the idea that vampires would always rise again, that their persistence was unshakable. It was this victory, perhaps more than any other, that cemented Marceline's role as a breaker of inevitability, someone who could turn what seemed eternal into something finite. At last, her campaign brought her face to face with the Vampire King himself. Unlike the others, the king was not simply a monster, but a monarch with philosophy, charisma, and overwhelming power. To defeat him was to confront not only the strongest of the vampires, but also the idea of their supremacy as a whole. The king carried the weight of inevitability in his very presence, and his philosophy of vampirism as a higher state of being gave his reign a sense of destiny. Marceline's battle with him was therefore the culmination of everything she had endured. The fear of her childhood, the resilience she had built as a hunter, the lessons she had learned in resisting the other members of the court. The clash with the king was not just a fight, but a reckoning. He was her greatest enemy and, in some ways, her mirror, a figure who stood at the center of the trauma that had shaped her life. Defeating him required all of her strength, her powers, her cunning, and her refusal to submit to the narrative of inevitability he embodied. In striking him down, Marceline did more than kill a vampire. She ended an era. The Age of Fear, the reign of the court, and the belief that vampires could never be defeated all fell with him. Her victory was both personal and historical, a transformation of Ooo itself. The fall of the court had profound consequences. Survivors who had lived under dread for generations suddenly found themselves free to imagine a different kind of life. The myths of vampire invincibility collapsed, replaced by stories of Marceline's triumph. Communities that had scattered began to rebuild, no longer paralysed by the certainty that vampires would return. The cycle of despair was broken, and in its place grew hope. Marceline's victories were not just her own. They became the victories of everyone who had suffered under the vampire's shadow. For Marceline herself, however, the triumph was bittersweet. She had destroyed the court, but in doing so, she bound herself to the identity of the hunter. Her victories isolated her further, setting her apart from others as someone defined by combat and loss. The scars of her battles were not only physical but emotional, carried in the loneliness of her songs and the mistrust that lingered in her relationships. The irony of her story was that in defeating the vampires, she became forever tied to them, her identity inseparable from the enemies she had destroyed. The fall of the vampire court stands as one of the defining events in Adventure Time's mythology. It was the moment when fear lost its hold on Ooo, when inevitability was broken, and when a child abandoned by her father and shaped by trauma rose to change history. It is the story of how one individual, armed with determination and resilience, stood against an empire of predators and won. And it is also the story of how that victory left her changed, scarred, and destined for an identity she could not escape. For while she destroyed the court, her connection to vampirism was only beginning, and the irony of her eventual transformation would ensure that the shadow of the vampires never truly left her life. The fall of the vampire court should have marked an ending. For the survivors of Ooo, it was the end of the Age of Fear, the end of centuries of domination by predators who seemed immortal, the end of inevitability itself. For Marceline, it was the culmination of years of survival, battles, and trauma, the proof that even a child abandoned to a ruined world could grow into a force strong enough to shatter the myths of invincibility. And yet, her story did not close with triumph. Instead, it turned with cruel irony, because in the very act of defeating the last of the great vampires, Marceline herself was transformed into one of them. The hunter became the hunted, the breaker of inevitability became its inheritor, and the girl who had spent her life resisting predators became defined by their curse. The moment of transformation came with her battle against the Vampire King. In striking him down, Marceline was infected, his power flowing into her through the bite that sealed his end. This was not a simple wound, but the transmission of the condition itself, the same magical infection that she had resisted her entire life. For other victims, a bite meant death or transformation into thralls who served their masters. For Marceline, it meant something far greater. She absorbed his powers, his essence, and with them the curse of vampirism. The victory that destroyed the king also ensured that his legacy lived on in her, not as an external threat, but as part of her very being. Becoming a vampire was not merely a change of abilities, it was a rewriting of identity. Marceline inherited traits that she had once fought against: immortality, hunger for blood, vulnerability to sunlight, and a connection to the same powers she had sought to destroy. She became the embodiment of what she had resisted, and with this change, came a crisis that shaped her for centuries. For someone whose life had been defined by fighting predators, to suddenly become one herself was a wound deeper than any physical scar. It raised questions that would never fully leave her. Was she still herself? Was she now the enemy she had hunted? Could she trust her own instincts, or were they now corrupted by the hunger she carried? The transformation was also tragic, because it tied Marceline to the very inevitability she had broken. She had proven that vampires could be defeated, that they were not eternal, and yet she herself became a vessel of their endurance. Through her, the cycle continued, though in a new form. Survivors, who had once looked to her as the end of the vampire threat, now saw in her a paradox, the saviour who was also the inheritor. The myths of her as a hunter became intertwined with whispers of her vampirism, and her reputation shifted from simple heroism to something more ambiguous. She was both admired and feared, both liberator and potential threat. For Marceline herself, the transformation created a life defined by contradiction. Immortality meant she would endure long after those she saved had passed away. Hunger meant that even in moments of peace, she carried the urge to consume others. Her powers gave her strength, but they also isolated her, separating her from the mortals she had once lived among. Her identity fractured between the human child, who had once felt hunger and fear, and the vampire who now embodied the very dread she had resisted. This tension would echo in her music, her relationships, and her constant search for belonging. It is important to note that Marceline did not simply accept her vampirism as a gift. Unlike other vampires, she carried the memory of what it meant to be hunted by them, the trauma of a childhood marked by their shadow, and the irony of becoming what she had hated most. This memory shaped how she lived as a vampire. She did not revel in domination like the Empress, nor enforce tradition like the Hierophant, nor embody inevitability like the Moon, nor spread chaos like the Fool, nor preach destiny like the King. Instead, she struggled. Her vampirism was not an ideology, but a burden, something she endured rather than celebrated. And this difference defined her for the rest of her life, setting her apart from every other vampire who had come before. Her transformation also deepened her isolation. As a hunter, she had already been set apart from others, living a life defined by combat and mistrust. As a vampire, the gap widened. She could not live among mortals without the constant reminder that she was now one of the creatures who had once preyed on them. Even when she sought companionship, her vampirism lingered as a wall between herself and others, a part of her identity that she could not shed. The loneliness that permeates Marceline's character throughout Adventure Time finds its roots in this transformation, in the moment when her triumph became her curse. Yet even within this tragedy, there was also resilience. Marceline did not become the kind of vampire the court had been. Though she carried their powers, she refused their philosophy. She resisted domination, rejected inevitability, and refused to let hunger define her. Her immortality gave her centuries to explore, to grow, and to redefine what it meant to be a vampire. In her, the curse became something new, not a cycle of fear, but a struggle toward identity. Her transformation, while tragic, also gave her the longevity to form relationships, to explore music, to wrestle with her past, and to eventually find reconciliation with her pain. Without vampirism, she might not have lived to form those bonds, to confront her father, or to stand beside Princess Bubblegum in later years. The irony of her transformation is central to her character. Marceline is not simply a vampire, nor simply a hero. She is both, caught between predator and protector, between curse and resilience. This duality gives her story its depth because it refuses simple resolution. She cannot undo what was done to her, but she can choose how to live with it. She cannot erase the powers she inherited from the king, but she can refuse to let them define her in the same way they defined him. Her transformation was not an end, but the beginning of a lifelong negotiation with identity, one that gave her both her greatest strengths and her deepest scars. In the broader history of Ooo, Marceline's transformation ensured that the vampires were never truly gone. Though she destroyed the court, their essence lived on through her. This continuity reinforces one of Adventure Time's central themes, that the past is never erased, only transformed. The trauma of the Mushroom War lingered in ruins and mutants. The trauma of vampirism lingered in Marceline. Her very existence became a living reminder of the history she had tried to destroy, proof that no cycle is broken without leaving a trace. For viewers, this transformation is also what makes Marceline one of the most compelling figures in the series. She is not simply a hero who triumphed over evil. She is a survivor who carries the enemy within her, a character whose contradictions make her relatable, tragic, and inspiring. She embodies the complexity of living with trauma, of carrying scars that cannot be erased, of finding identity not in purity but in contradiction. Her transformation into a vampire is the heart of that complexity, the moment when her story became something more than simple victory or defeat. The transformation of Marceline into a vampire is therefore not only a turning point in her own life, but also in the history of Ooo. It ensured that the fall of the court was not the end of vampirism, but its evolution. It created a figure who was both liberator and inheritor, both hunter and predator, both victim and survivor. And it gave Adventure Time one of its richest and most enduring characters, a reminder that triumph and tragedy often come hand in hand, and that identity is forged not only in victory, but in the burdens we carry afterward. Centuries passed after Marceline's transformation. The court was gone, the age of fear had ended, and Ooo moved forward into new eras of kingdoms, experiments, and shifting power. Marceline lived on, her immortality keeping her tethered to a world that changed around her. The memories of the vampires lingered as scars, but for a time they were just that, memories. It seemed as if the age of their reign was finally over. Yet in Adventure Time, the past is never buried for long. Cycles return, wounds reopen, and inevitabilities resurface in new forms. And so it was with the Vampire King, whose return centuries later reignited questions not only about vampirism, but about Marceline herself, about the meaning of her victories, and about the possibility of change, even within curses thought eternal. The return of the Vampire King is explored most vividly in Stakes, the 8-part miniseries that confronts Marceline's vampiric nature directly. The story begins with her desire to finally rid herself of vampirism. After centuries of living as a vampire, defined by immortality and hunger, she chooses to undergo a process to extract her vampiric essence, hoping to reclaim her humanity. This decision reflects the weight of her transformation. Though she had survived, though she had found strength and even companionship, the curse still haunted her. She saw it as an anchor to trauma, a mark of isolation, and a reminder of everything she had once resisted. By attempting to undo it, she sought not only freedom for herself, but closure for a story that had begun long before. But in the act of extracting her vampirism, Marceline inadvertently resurrects the very enemies she had destroyed. Her essence carries within it the remnants of the court, and when it is released, the vampires return, including the Vampire King himself. This twist is quintessential Adventure Time. The attempt to erase the past instead brings it back to the surface, proving that history cannot be undone so easily. The return of the king in particular is more than a physical threat, it is a thematic reckoning. For Marceline, it forces her to confront not only the vampires once more, but also her own identity, her choices, and the contradictions that have defined her life. The resurrected vampire king is not the same figure she once defeated. Though he retains his immense power and charisma, he carries a new perspective. Centuries of death and resurrection have given him a reflective quality, and in Stakes he reveals a surprising desire to be free of vampirism himself. He does not return to reclaim his throne or rebuild his empire. Instead, he seeks release from the very condition that once defined him. This shift in his character recontextualizes his reign. Where once he had embraced vampirism as destiny, he now views it as a burden. In this, he mirrors Marceline herself, who has long wrestled with the curse she carries. The king's return is therefore not simply a revival of an old enemy, but the emergence of a mirror, a figure whose struggle parallels Marceline's own. This transformation in the king forces Marceline to see him differently. He is no longer just the predator who haunted her childhood, or the monarch she struck down. He is a being caught in the same paradox she inhabits, a creature of immense power who longs for release, who questions what it means to live eternally by consuming others, who wonders if identity can be separated from curse. Their conflict is no longer purely external but philosophical. Should vampirism be preserved or destroyed? Is it a destiny or a burden? In these questions, the king becomes less an enemy to be slain and more a foil to Marceline's own search for meaning. Yet even with this reflective quality, the king remains dangerous. His return sparks chaos, revives fear, and draws the other members of the court back into existence. Though he may wish for freedom, his very presence ensures that vampirism continues to spread, threatening Ooo once again. Marceline cannot simply accept his change of heart. She must still confront him as the central figure of the vampire condition. Their interactions are layered with irony. She, the hunter who became a vampire, and he, the vampire who longs not to be one. Together, they embody the contradictions of the cycle, and their confrontation becomes less about destruction and more about resolution. The king's desire to transcend vampirism culminates in his decision to pass the curse on. Rather than embracing his powers, he seeks to shed them, to live as something other than the monarch of predators. In doing so, he forces Marceline to confront the possibility that vampirism is not a destiny carved in stone, but a condition that can be transformed, redirected, or even ended. This challenges her perception of herself, because for centuries she has seen vampirism as an unshakable part of her identity. The king's return destabilizes that certainty, opening the door to the possibility that even curses can evolve. For the broader world of Ooo, the return of the king and the court is a reminder of how fragile peace, truly island. Kingdoms may rise, friendships may flourish, but the traumas of the past linger beneath the surface, ready to erupt again. The fact that Marceline's own attempt to remove her curse is what revives them underscores the theme that history cannot simply be excised. It must be confronted, lived with, and transformed. The King's Return is therefore not only a story about vampires, but a story about memory, trauma, and the impossibility of erasing what has already shaped us. What makes The King's Return so powerful in Stakes is how it reframes both him and Marceline. He is no longer the unambiguous villain of her childhood, but a complex figure wrestling with the same burdens she carries. She is no longer just the hunter or the cursed survivor, but someone faced with the reality that even her enemies can change. Their confrontation becomes a dialogue about identity, immortality, and the meaning of release. By the end, Marceline does not simply destroy him again. She participates in his choice to shed his vampirism, to leave behind the empire of blood and hunger. In this, the cycle of inevitability is altered, not by force, but by transformation. The return of the Vampire King therefore serves as both a continuation and a resolution. It continues the cycle of vampirism by reviving the court, reigniting old fears, and forcing Marceline back into battle. But it also resolves the story of the king himself, showing that even the embodiment of vampiric destiny can change, that inevitability is not absolute. For Marceline, it affirms that her struggle is not about erasing her curse, but about living with it, redefining it, and choosing what it means for her. For Ooo, it demonstrates once again that history is never truly gone, but it can be reshaped. The king's return closes the circle of his reign. He began as the monarch who defined vampirism, rose as the figure of inevitability, fell to Marceline's defiance, and returned centuries later as a being who longed for release. His story mirrors Marceline's own arc, both hunter and vampire, both burdened and enduring, both defined by contradictions that give their characters depth. His return was not about restoring fear, but about showing that even in a world defined by cycles, transformation is possible. The return of the Vampire King was shocking enough, but his resurrection was not an isolated event. When Marceline attempted to purge her vampirism during the events of Stakes, the release of her essence brought back more than just the king. The other members of the court, the Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, and the Moon, were restored as well, rising from the void of history to once again haunt the land of Ooo. For centuries they had been gone, their powers and personalities relegated to memory and legend. But with a single act they were returned, and the age of fear threatened to begin anew. This resurgence of the court forced Marceline, Finn, Jake, and Princess Bubblegum to confront not only the physical danger of the vampires, but the symbolic weight of history repeating itself, of cycles that refused to die quietly. Each vampire returned as if no time had passed at all. The Fool emerged with the same chaotic energy that had once made him so unpredictable. His agility, his erratic movements, and his unhinged laughter all carried the aura of inevitability, as though he had never been defeated. For Marceline, facing him again was more than a rematch. It was a reminder that victories are never permanent. The Fool's tricks served as a metaphor for history's ability to slip through fingers, to reappear when least expected, and to turn certainty into confusion. Though Finn and Jake fought bravely alongside her, the Fool's unpredictability tested their ability to respond to chaos. His return reminded everyone that vampires were not just powerful but disorienting, turning battles into games where the rules changed at every moment. The Empress re-emerged as well, bringing with her the insidious power of domination. In her eyes and her voice was the ability to strip free will away, turning friends into enemies and allies into puppets. For Finn and Jake, this power was terrifying because it threatened not just their bodies but their bonds. For Marceline, facing the Empress again reopened wounds of autonomy, forcing her to resist once more the temptation to give in. What made the Empress so dangerous was not only her hypnotic control, but the confidence with which she wielded it. She was certain of her supremacy, certain that mortals and even other vampires could not resist her. In Stakes, her presence challenged Marceline to reaffirm her independence, to stand against a force that sought to erase individuality. The Empress's return emphasized that vampires did not always kill their prey. Sometimes they hollowed them out, leaving shells of obedience behind. The Hierophant's return brought with it a different kind of threat. His obsession with the laws of vampirism and his commitment to tradition made him a figure of rigid danger. In his eyes, the vampire race was meant to survive unchanged, bound to rules that preserved their purity. His shape-shifting and martial prowess made him a formidable combatant, and his disdain for anything that did not conform to his standards made him intolerant of difference. For Marceline, this confrontation was not only physical but ideological. As someone who had lived centuries balancing her demonic heritage, her human childhood, and her vampirism, she was the antithesis of the Hierophant's rigidity. Their battle represented a clash between tradition and hybridity, between the idea that identity must remain pure and the reality that identity is always fluid. In defeating him again, Marceline did more than win a duel. She rejected the notion that the past could dictate the terms of the future. The moon was perhaps the most haunting of the court to return. With her endless regeneration, she embodied the very concept of persistence, of wounds that never heal, of cycles that never end. In her pale form and her quiet menace was the reminder that vampirism itself is a kind of immortality that cannot be undone easily. When she rose again, it was as though the inevitability of vampirism itself had been resurrected. For Finn, Jake, and Bubblegum, her powers tested their resolve, because no matter how many times she was struck down, she rose again. For Marceline, the moon's return was the deepest insult of all. She had fought so hard to break the cycle of inevitability, to prove that vampires could be defeated, and yet here was the living embodiment of that cycle, unbroken and undiminished. The battle with the moon was therefore not only about survival, but about Marceline's own spirit. To defeat her again was to reaffirm the possibility of ending what seems eternal, even if only temporarily. Together, the resurgence of the court revealed the fragility of history. Marceline's campaign centuries earlier had destroyed them, but their return showed that victories are not final. Trauma does not vanish, cycles do not end, and the past always has ways of resurfacing. For Marceline, this was devastating, because it forced her to relive the very battles that had defined and scarred her. For Finn, Jake, and Bubblegum, it was a lesson in the persistence of old dangers, that even heroes cannot simply sweep away the shadows of history. Ooo itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the vampire's return, as if the land remembered the age of fear and trembled at the possibility of its repetition. Yet there was also something different this time. Marceline was not alone. Where once she had fought as a solitary child, now she fought alongside friends. Finn and Jake brought their bravery and their loyalty. Bubblegum added her science and her leadership. The resurgence of the court therefore became more than just a rematch. It was a rewriting of history. This time, the vampires did not face a lonely hunter, but a community of allies. The symbolism was clear. While history may repeat itself, it does not always do so in the same way. Cycles may resurface, but the conditions under which they play out can change, and in those changes lies hope. The battles against the resurrected court in Stakes are some of the most powerful moments in Adventure Time, because they tie together past and present, trauma and healing, inevitability and resilience. Each vampire returned as if nothing had changed, but Marceline had changed. She was no longer the frightened child or the lonely hunter. She was someone who had lived through centuries, carried her scars, and built relationships that grounded her. Though she still struggled with her identity, she was no longer defined solely by her fear of vampires. The resurgence of the court, therefore, became an opportunity not just to relive the past, but to transform it, to face the same enemies with new strength and new understanding. In the end, the court was defeated again, but the meaning of their resurgence lingered. It proved that the vampires were not merely creatures of the past, but persistent forces that could return whenever the conditions allowed. It reminded everyone, Marceline most of all, that history is not erased by victory, and it also showed that while the past may resurface, the present can reshape its outcome. The Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, and the Moon each represented an aspect of inevitability, but their second defeat reaffirmed that inevitability is not absolute. The court rose again, and again they fell, not because history had changed, but because Marceline had. Among all the members of the vampire court, none embodied psychological danger quite like the Empress. Where the Fool represented chaos, the Hierophant rigid tradition, the Moon endless persistence, and the King inevitability itself, the Empress embodied control, not through force of arms, but through the ability to override free will. Her power was not in how many she could kill, but in how many she could bend. The danger of the Empress lay in the collapse of autonomy, in the way she could turn allies into puppets, stripping away the very core of identity. For Marceline, facing her again in stakes was not just a battle against another vampire. It was the reopening of an old wound, a direct confrontation with her trauma, and a reminder of how deeply the vampires had scarred her life. The Empress's ability to hypnotize and dominate others was perhaps the most insidious of all vampire powers. Hunger, strength, and regeneration could be fought with weapons and strategy, but the Empress struck at something deeper: agency. With a glance, she could take away choice, leaving her victims aware but powerless, compelled to obey her will. In a world already defined by fear and instability, this power represented a kind of hopelessness. Survivors who might otherwise resist were stripped of resistance itself. The Empress turned freedom into submission, eroding not only lives, but the very concept of defiance. In this sense, she was the perfect counter to someone like Marceline, whose identity had always been built on independence, resistance, and refusal to submit. Their encounters carried a psychological weight unlike Marceline's battles with other vampires. With the Fool, she fought chaos. With the Hierophant, tradition. With the Moon, inevitability. But with the Empress, the fight was about her own sense of self. The Empress had the ability to exploit Marceline's fears of losing control, of being defined not by her choices, but by her curse. After centuries of struggling with her vampirism, of wondering if she was still herself or merely a creature bound by hunger, the Empress represented the possibility that identity itself could be stolen. To resist her was not just to win a fight, but to protect the very core of who Marceline was. What made the Empress so terrifying is how familiar she felt to Marceline's trauma. As a child abandoned by her father and later transformed against her will into a vampire, Marceline's life had been defined by forces outside her control. She had always carried the pain of being acted upon rather than acting, of having her destiny shaped by others. The Empress magnified this fear. By trying to take Marceline's will away, she forced Marceline to relive the vulnerability of her childhood, to feel again the helplessness of being unable to stop what was happening to her. In this sense, the Empress was not just a vampire. She was a symbol of Marceline's deepest anxieties, the embodiment of her fear of losing herself. The confrontation in stakes between Marceline and the Empress is layered with this psychological tension. When the Empress attempts to control Marceline, she is not just using her power as she would against any victim. She is targeting someone whose identity has always been fragile, someone who has fought her whole life to define herself against curses, abandonment, and trauma. Marceline's resistance in this moment becomes a reaffirmation of her autonomy, a declaration that despite everything she has endured, she will not surrender Houshi Island. Unlike the battles with the Fool or the Hierophant, this fight is intimate, almost personal, because it touches the raw nerve of Marceline's history. What makes the Empress stand out in the mythology of Adventure Time is how she shifts the focus from physical danger to psychological warfare. Vampires as a group often embody inevitability, persistence, or hunger, but the Empress reveals how terrifying it is to lose control of oneself. For viewers, her power resonates because it parallels real fears of manipulation, coercion, and the erasure of individuality. For Marceline, this resonance is magnified by her past, making the Empress not just another enemy, but a reflection of her deepest insecurities. Yet Marceline's victory over the Empress is powerful precisely because of what it represents. By resisting her control and defeating her, Marceline reaffirms her independence, proving that even the most insidious powers cannot strip away her identity. This triumph is not just about ending a vampire's reign, but about reclaiming herself from the trauma of her past. In the Empress's fall, Marceline demonstrates that she is more than her curse, more than her scars, and more than the manipulations of those who once defined her. She shows that identity is not something others can take, it is something she chooses to hold, no matter the pressure. The Empress's return and defeat in Stakes also reinforces one of the series' central themes, that history repeats itself, but it can also be reshaped. Marceline had faced the Empress centuries before, as a hunter fighting for survival, and now she faced her again as a vampire struggling for self-acceptance. The circumstances were different, but the challenge was the same. Resist control, assert independence, and refuse to be defined by someone else's power. The fact that Marceline wins again, this time not alone, but with the support of her friends, underscores how trauma can be revisited and healed, not by erasing it, but by confronting it with new strength. In the grand arc of the Vampires of Ooo, the Empress may not have ruled as long or as powerfully as the king, but her symbolic role is undeniable. She represents the fear of losing oneself, the terror that identity can be stolen, and the cruelty of domination disguised as care. For Marceline, she is a reminder of the fragility of agency, but also a testament to resilience. By standing against her, Marceline not only defeats a vampire, but also proves that her identity is stronger than her curse, stronger than her trauma, and stronger than the forces that once tried to control her life. The Empress's story ends not with domination, but with defeat, and in that defeat lies Marceline's victory over her past. Though trauma never disappears entirely, Marceline demonstrates that it can be faced, resisted, and redefined. The Empress may have embodied control, but Marceline embodied defiance, and in their clash, defiance won. Among the members of the vampire court, the Hierophant stood apart as a figure defined not by chaos, seduction, or brute charisma, but by structure. His very name suggested authority, ritual, and devotion to tradition. Where the Fool thrived in unpredictability, the Empress in control, the Moon in endurance, and the King in philosophy, the Hierophant was the enforcer of rules, the guardian of vampiric law, and the embodiment of purity. For him, vampirism was not simply a condition or a hunger, but a way of life bound to codes that preserved its essence. In this, he represented the oldest and most rigid dimension of the vampire identity, and his clashes with Marceline revealed the tension between tradition and change. between the idea of vampirism as eternal law and identity, as something fluid and evolving. The Hierophant's return in stakes was a reminder that history often reasserts itself through its most rigid defenders. When resurrected alongside the rest of the court, he carried with him not only his physical powers, but his ideology, insisting on the old ways of vampirism with uncompromising zeal. He disdained alliances with mortals, rejected deviations from established practices, and sought to reimpose order on a world that had long since moved beyond his vision. In his eyes, the vampires were a race apart, destined to rule through their traditions, and any dilution of that heritage was a betrayal. This rigid worldview made him perhaps the most ideological of the court, less interested in feeding or ruling for pleasure, and more focused on maintaining what he saw as the sacred purity of vampirism. Physically, the Hierophant was one of the most formidable vampires Marceline ever faced. His mastery of shapeshifting allowed him to shift between monstrous forms, turning himself into wolves, bats, and other predators at will. His combat skills were honed by centuries of experience, and his adherence to law gave him discipline in battle that others lacked. He was not reckless like the fool, nor indulgent like the empress, nor resigned like the moon. Every move he made was calculated, every strike deliberate, as though he were enacting not just violence but a ritual of enforcement. To fight him was to fight the weight of tradition itself, a battle against something that felt not only physical but historical. For Marceline, the Hierophant was a particularly meaningful adversary because he represented everything she was not. Marceline's identity was defined by hybridity, human origins, demonic blood from her father, vampirism from the king. She was a mixture of lineages and experiences, someone who could never fit into a single category. The Hierophant, by contrast, stood for purity, for a rigid identity, untainted by outside influences. His disdain for hybrids and deviations made him view Marceline not only as an enemy, but as an abomination, a violation of the laws he had sworn to uphold. Their clash was therefore not merely a fight between hunter and vampire, but a symbolic confrontation between purity and hybridity, rigidity and fluidity, law and freedom. What makes the Hierophant significant in Adventure Time's mythology is the way his ideology reflects broader themes of the series. Ooo is a world defined by mixtures of science and magic, of human and mutant, of past and future. Nothing is pure in Ooo. Everything is hybrid, transformed or remade. The Hierophant's insistence on purity places him at odds not just with Marceline, but with the world itself. His rigidity is unsustainable in a land that thrives on change, adaptation, and fusion. His battles are therefore doomed not only because Marceline is strong enough to defeat him, but because his very worldview is incompatible with the reality of Ooo. When Marceline defeats the Hierophant, it is more than a physical victory. It is a symbolic rejection of the notion that the past can dictate the future in rigid terms. Her victory asserts that identity is not bound to law or tradition, but can be shaped, remade, and lived in defiance of old rules. In her, the hybrid child turned vampire, the contradictions of Ooo find their clearest expression. The Hierophant calls her an abomination, but it is precisely her hybridity that gives her strength. She embodies the truth that survival in Ooo comes not from purity, but from adaptation. And in defeating him, she proves that the future belongs not to those who cling to old laws, but to those who embrace change. The Hierophant's role also highlights Marceline's personal struggle with her identity. For centuries, she wrestled with what it meant to be human, demon, and vampire all at once. The Hierophant's contempt for her forced her to confront those insecurities directly. By standing against him, she affirmed that her mixed heritage was not a weakness, but a strength, that the parts of herself that others rejected were precisely what made her resilient. In this way, the battle with the Hierophant was not just about defeating an enemy, but about accepting herself, about turning the criticisms of others into affirmations of her own identity. Thematically, the Hierophant embodies the dangers of clinging to the past too tightly. His obsession with tradition blinds him to the reality of the present, making him unable to adapt, unable to grow, and ultimately unable to survive. Adventure Time often presents characters who struggle with change. Princess Bubblegum with her need for control, Ice King with his loss of self, Marceline with her trauma. But the Hierophant represents the extreme, the refusal to change at all. His downfall is therefore inevitable, because in a world as fluid and unpredictable as Ooo, rigidity is death. The defeat of the Hierophant also underscores the importance of community. Though Marceline bore the brunt of his ideology, she did not stand alone. Finn, Jake, and Bubblegum fought alongside her, and their presence highlighted how hybridity is not just personal but collective. The alliance of humans, magical creatures, and hybrids reflects the reality of Ooo, a place where strength comes from diversity rather than purity. The Hierophant's contempt for this diversity ensured his downfall because he could not comprehend the strength of a world built on mixtures and contradictions. In the end, the Hierophant story is not one of redemption or change, but of collapse. He could not evolve, could not accept the hybridity of the world, and so he was defeated by someone who embodied that hybridity completely. His death reaffirmed that Ooo does not belong to those who cling to old laws, but to those who embrace fluidity, resilience, and adaptation. Marceline's triumph over him was therefore not only the end of one vampire, but the affirmation of her own place in the world, a place defined not by purity, but by the strength of contradiction. The Hierophant may not be as memorable as the king or as insidious as the empress, but his role in the mythology of the vampires is crucial. He represents the rigidity of tradition, the dangers of law without flexibility, and the rejection of difference. By defeating him, Marceline proved that the world of Ooo belongs not to the rigid, but to the adaptable, not to the pure, but to the hybrid. In that victory, she not only saved Ooo once more, but also saved herself, reclaiming her identity as something to be embraced rather than feared. Among the vampires of Ooo, the moon stands as one of the most haunting figures, not because of her personality or her charisma, but because of what she represents. Where the fool thrived in chaos, the empress in control, and the Hierophant in rigid law, the moon embodied endurance itself. Her regenerative abilities meant that no matter how many times she was struck down, she would rise again, whole and unbroken. She was not a creature of passion or philosophy, but of persistence, a living symbol of immortality and recurrence. In her, vampirism revealed its most terrifying quality, the inability to end. To face the moon was to confront futility, to realize that even the most decisive victories could be undone in an instant. For Marceline, who had built her identity on the act of defeating inevitability, the moon was perhaps the most personal reminder that some battles seem designed never to be won. When the moon returned during stakes, she brought with her the same quiet menace that had defined her centuries before. She was not loud like the fool, not domineering like the empress, not rigid like the Hierophant, and not philosophical like the king. Instead, she was patient, methodical, and unstoppable. Every strike against her healed. Every attempt to destroy her proved temporary. In this way, she embodied the persistence of trauma, the way old wounds resurface no matter how many times they are suppressed. For the people of Ooo, she was a nightmare because she made resistance feel pointless. For Marceline, she was a nightmare because she forced her to relive the cycles of her own life, the constant return of pain, loss, and hunger, no matter how many times she tried to escape them. The moon's power was unique in that it required her enemies to confront despair directly. To fight her was to fight exhaustion, to watch as wounds closed and progress vanished. This demoralizing quality made her one of the most dangerous vampires of the court. Where others inspired fear through spectacle or ideology, the moon inspired fear through inevitability. She did not need to be fast, cunning, or manipulative. She only needed to endure, and in that endurance, she reminded her enemies of their own mortality. Against her immortality, their efforts seemed small, fleeting, destined to fade. For Marceline, this was especially cruel. She had spent her life trying to prove that inevitability could be broken, that the vampires were not immortal gods but beings who could be slain. She had defeated the fool, the empress, the hierophant, and even the king, building a legend on the act of tearing down the myth of invincibility. And yet here was the moon, rising again and again, mocking the very foundation of Marceline's victories. Every blow against her felt like striking against history itself, a futile attempt to erase what refused to be erased. In this way, the moon became the embodiment of Marceline's greatest fear, that her efforts, her battles, her triumphs would ultimately mean nothing because the past would always return. The symbolism of the moon extends beyond vampirism. She represents the cycles that define life and trauma. Just as the moon in the sky waxes and wanes, returning each night without fail, the vampire moon returned from every strike, her presence a metaphor for the cycles of suffering that shape existence. In Marceline's case, these cycles were deeply personal: abandonment, loneliness, the burden of immortality, the hunger of vampirism. Each time she tried to move forward, these pains resurfaced, just as the moon resurfaced, no matter how many times she was destroyed. This is why the battle with the moon is one of the most thematically resonant in Stakes. It is less about defeating an enemy and more about resisting despair itself. Yet Marceline does defeat her, and that victory is not just physical but symbolic. To strike down the moon and ensure her end is to declare that cycles, while persistent, are not absolute. History may repeat itself, but it can be changed. Trauma may resurface, but it can be confronted. Immortality may seem endless, but it can be challenged. Marceline's triumph over the moon reaffirmed her role as the breaker of inevitability, the one who refuses to accept that some things are unchangeable. The victory did not erase her scars, nor did it permanently end the cycles of her life, but it proved that even the most enduring of enemies could fall, even if only for a time. The moon also forces us to consider the double-edged nature of immortality. On the surface, immortality seems like a gift. Endless life, endless endurance, the ability to outlast all others. But in the moon, we see its curse. To persist endlessly is to become a cycle without meaning, to rise again and again without change or growth. The moon embodies stasis, immortality stripped of purpose, and in that stasis lies horror. Marceline, who herself is immortal, sees in the moon a distorted reflection of her own condition. She too persists while others fade. She too rises after wounds, and she too risks falling into stasis if she does not find meaning in her immortality. The moon is therefore not just an enemy, but a mirror, showing Marceline the emptiness that immortality can become if it is not tempered by growth and connection. What makes the moon distinct from the other vampires is how little she relies on personality. She is less a character than a concept, less an individual than an embodiment. This makes her eerie and unsettling, because she seems more like a force of nature than a person. In this way, she mirrors death itself, inevitable, impartial, and relentless. Her presence in the court underscores that vampirism is not just about hunger or domination, but about persistence beyond reason, the refusal of an ending. For viewers, this makes her both frightening and symbolic, because she embodies the parts of life we cannot escape, the parts that always return. In the larger mythology of Adventure Time, the moon serves as a reminder that cycles are at the heart of Oo's history. The Mushroom War, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the return of the Lich, the reappearance of vampires, all are cycles that repeat, sometimes altered, sometimes not. The moon is the vampire embodiment of that truth, a being who refuses to stay gone. Her defeat does not erase the cycles, but it shows that resistance is possible, that endurance can be met with defiance, and that even the most persistent forces can be overcome with enough will. For Marceline, the battle with the moon deepened her understanding of herself. It forced her to confront the reality of her own immortality, to recognize the danger of stasis, and to reaffirm her need to find meaning beyond simply existing. It reminded her that to endure without change is to become hollow, and that the only way to make immortality bearable is to live fully, to connect, to grow, and to resist despair. The moon's fall, therefore, marked not only the defeat of a vampire, but also a step in Marceline's ongoing journey toward accepting her identity and her place in a world defined by cycles. In the end, the moon was not the most powerful of the vampires, nor the most cunning, nor the most charismatic. But she was the most symbolic, the one who most clearly revealed what vampirism means when stripped to its core. She was persistence without purpose, immortality without growth, trauma without healing. And in defeating her, Marceline reaffirmed that even the most enduring scars can be confronted, even the most relentless cycles can be challenged, and even immortality itself can find meaning through choice. The resurgence of the vampire court in Stakes was not simply a return of old enemies. It was the reappearance of history itself, brought back into the present through Marceline's attempt to purge her curse. One by one, the Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, and the Moon fell again, just as they had centuries before, each confrontation echoing battles long past. Yet as long as the Vampire King remained, the cycle endured. He was the figure at the centre of the vampire identity, the monarch who had once unified them, and the symbol of inevitability that still loomed over Ooh. The final act of Stakes was not just about defeating him again, but about resolving the cycle of vampirism itself, closing a story that had begun long before Marceline ever lifted a sword. The king's return was unlike that of the others. The Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, and the Moon rose unchanged, carrying with them the same powers, philosophies, and dangers they had embodied before. The king, however, returned with reflection. Centuries of death and resurrection had altered him, softening his certainty, shifting his perspective. Where once he had embraced vampirism as destiny, he now longed for release. He was no longer simply a predator, but a figure who had grown weary of the curse that had defined him. This change made the final confrontation not simply a rematch, but a philosophical reckoning. Should vampirism continue, or should it finally end? Marceline's role in this confrontation was layered with irony. She had once destroyed the king and inherited his powers, becoming the very creature she had hunted. She had lived with that irony for centuries, defined by it, scarred by it. Now she faced him again, not as a child or even as a solitary hunter, but as someone who had come to understand the complexities of identity, the weight of immortality, and the persistence of trauma. In him, she saw not just an enemy, but a mirror, someone who also struggled with the curse, someone who also wondered if there was a way out. Their dialogue in Stakes reveals this shift. The king is not a tyrant demanding obedience, but a weary monarch seeking an end. The climax of the story comes when the king transfers his vampirism out of himself, releasing the curse rather than wielding it. In doing so, he demonstrates that even inevitability can change form. His choice to shed his essence reframes vampirism itself, no longer an unbreakable curse, but a condition that can be transformed. The king does not fall by Marceline's blade this time, but by his own decision, by his refusal to continue the cycle. This is perhaps the most radical act in the history of the Vampires of Ooo, the king, once the embodiment of destiny, choosing to reject it. For Marceline, this moment is transformative. She had spent centuries defining herself against vampirism, resisting it, suffering under it, and carrying it as both strength and burden. To see the king release, it forces her to reconsider what it means to live with her own curse. If even the greatest of vampires can choose change, then perhaps vampirism is not the absolute she always believed it to be. The end of the king's line does not erase her struggles, but it reframes them, offering the possibility that identity is not fixed, that even curses can evolve, and that inevitability is never final. Thematically, the end of the vampire line represents closure for an arc that stretches across Adventure Time's history. Vampirism, once the greatest terror of the wastelands, once the force that defined Marceline's trauma and identity, is finally brought to an end as a cultural and existential threat. The court no longer lingers as predators over Ooo. Their myths, their powers, their philosophies, all dissolve with the fall of their king. The cycle that began in the ruins of the Mushroom War, that shaped Marceline's childhood and scarred her life, closes in this moment of release. But closure does not mean erasure. Vampirism lives on in Marceline herself, in her immortality, in her hunger, and in the contradictions that define her. The end of the line does not undo her transformation or heal her scars. Instead, it affirms that she is no longer defined by enemies who once ruled her world. The vampires are gone, but she remains, carrying both the trauma of the past and the resilience to move forward. The story shifts from survival against inevitability to the question of what comes after, how one lives when the cycle of fear is finally broken. The end of the vampire line also reveals something central about Adventure Time's approach to storytelling. Villains are rarely one-dimensional, and endings are rarely simple. The king is not destroyed by violence, but by choice. The vampires are not erased by brute force, but by transformation. And Marceline's victory is not about domination, but about reconciliation with her past, with her identity, and with the inevitabilities she once thought unbreakable. In this way, the series resists the typical narrative of final battles. Instead, it offers something more nuanced, the idea that true endings come not through destruction, but through change. For Ooo, the end of the vampire line marks the closing of one of its darkest chapters. No longer would the land tremble at the return of the court. No longer would the age of fear haunt survivors. The vampires became history, remembered in songs, myths, and scars, but no longer present as threats. For Marceline, the ending was more complicated. She had finally closed the cycle that began in her childhood, but she remained a vampire, living with the contradictions that defined her. Yet even in this, there was hope. If the king could choose release, then perhaps she too could find peace, not by erasing her identity, but by embracing it on her own terms. In the end, the fall of the vampires is less about their destruction and more about Marceline's growth. The child who once hid from predators, the hunter who once slew inevitability, the vampire who once carried the curse, and the woman who now watches the cycle end, all of these stages converge in this moment. The end of the vampire line is also the culmination of Marceline's journey, proof that the past can be faced, that cycles can close, and that identity can survive even when curses linger. The story of the Vampires of Ooo does not end with their destruction. It lives on in memory, in scars, in songs, and most of all in Marceline herself. Across the ruins of the Mushroom War, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through centuries of loneliness and connection, the vampires defined an era of fear and inevitability. But they also defined Marceline, forcing her to grow, to fight, to suffer, and ultimately to endure. When the last of the vampire line was finally broken in stakes, it closed the chapter on the court, but it did not close the chapter on their legacy. That legacy survives in the way Ooo remembers them, as terrors of the past, and in the way Marceline continues to embody the contradictions of her identity, both victim and survivor, hunter and vampire. Marceline's legacy as the Vampire Queen is inseparable from her battles against the court. She is remembered as the one who defeated inevitability, the child who struck down predators that had ruled for centuries, the woman who faced her enemies again when they rose from the grave of history. Her name carries both fear and admiration, because she is not merely a vampire, but the vampire, the one who turned their curse into her own resilience. For survivors, her story was a beacon of hope. For Finn and Jake, she became an ally defined by strength, vulnerability, and loyalty. For Princess Bubblegum, she was a partner, a confidant, and a symbol of how the past can be confronted but not erased. Marceline's legacy lies not just in her victories, but in the way her story continues to resonate with those around her. Yet her legacy is also deeply personal. The Vampires of Ooo shaped her childhood, her trauma, and her sense of self. Even after their final defeat, the scars remained. Marceline's songs often return to themes of abandonment, hunger, and the search for belonging, echoes of a life defined by the shadows of the court. She cannot escape the contradictions of being both the destroyer of vampires and one of their kind. But this contradiction is precisely what makes her compelling. Her legacy is not purity or triumph without cost. It is survival despite scars, identity forged in contradiction, and the ability to live with complexity. The vampires themselves leave a legacy as well. They symbolize the cycles that define Ooo, fear that resurfaces, trauma that persists, inevitability that seems unbreakable. Each member of the court embodied an aspect of these cycles, the fool as chaos, the empress as control, the hierophant as tradition, the moon as persistence, and the king as inevitability itself. Their stories remind us that power does not always come from numbers, but from the ability to shape perception, to make others believe that resistance is futile. The age of fear was not sustained by constant battle, but by despair, and that despair was the vampire's greatest weapon. Their legacy lives on as a warning about the dangers of inevitability, about the way cycles can entrap societies and individuals alike. Marceline's confrontation with them first as hunter, later as vampire, and finally as survivor, transforms that legacy. She proves that inevitability can be broken, that trauma can be confronted, that cycles can end. But she also shows that endings are never absolute. Vampirism did not vanish from Ooo. It lived on in her. Trauma did not fade. It shaped her relationships and her songs. Immortality did not become a gift. It remained a burden she carried. Her victories did not erase her past, but they gave her the strength to live with it. This is the essence of her legacy. Not erasure, but endurance. Not purity, but resilience. In the broader scope of Adventure Time, Marceline and the Vampires symbolize the show's commitment to complexity. The vampires are not simply monsters to be slain, nor is Marceline simply a hero who triumphs. The court reflects philosophies, cycles, and fears that persist even after death. Marceline reflects the contradictions of living with trauma, of being both predator and protector, both cursed and chosen. Her legacy reminds us that identity is not fixed but negotiated, that survival is not about erasing scars but carrying them with dignity. The epilogue of Adventure Time shows Marceline alive and well, still playing her music, still bound to Princess Bubblegum, still living with the contradictions of her identity. The vampires are gone, but their influence remains, woven into the person she has become. Her relationship with Bubblegum in particular underscores how far she has come from her days of isolation. Where once she faced vampires alone, she now faces life with a partner. Where once she was defined by trauma, she now finds meaning in connection. Her legacy is therefore not only about survival, but about growth, not only about scars, but about healing. For Ooo, the legacy of the vampires is cautionary. Their reign is remembered as an age of fear, their resurgence as a cycle of trauma. But their end is remembered as the moment when inevitability was broken, when history itself shifted. The court became myth, their names echoing only in stories, while Marceline endured as the living reminder of what it means to resist. In this way, the legacy of the vampires and the legacy of Marceline are intertwined, inseparable, two sides of the same story. What makes this conclusion so powerful is its refusal to simplify. Marceline's legacy is not one of easy triumph. She did not destroy the vampires without cost. She did not emerge unscarred. She did not erase her curse. Instead, she lives with it, finds meaning in it, and continues forward despite it. This complexity mirrors real experiences of trauma and survival, making her one of Adventure Time's most relatable and enduring characters. She is not the hero who defeats evil and walks away whole. She is the survivor who defeats inevitability but carries its weight forever. The Vampires of Ooo will never return in the same way, but their influence is eternal because they shaped the woman who shaped history. In Marceline, their legacy lives on transformed, no longer a cycle of despair, but a story of resilience. She took their curse and turned it into strength, took their inevitability and turned it into defiance, took their immortality and turned it into survival. Her legacy is not that she erased the vampires, but that she transcended them, proving that even the deepest scars can become part of a life worth living. In the end, the history of the Vampires of Ooo is the history of Marceline herself. They rose in the wastelands, reigned in fear, scarred a child, and were struck down by that same child grown into a hunter. They returned centuries later, resurrected by her attempt to cure herself, and fell again, this time not just to her sword, but to the transformation of their king. And through it all, Marceline endured, carrying their legacy within her while forging her own. The vampires are gone, but Marceline remains, the Vampire Queen, the survivor of cycles, the breaker of inevitability, and the living reminder that even in a world defined by trauma, love, music, and connection, can turn scars into something meaningful.